We don't negotiate with part-time contractors. That's what Brandon Sullivan said during our March 14, 2024 budget review meeting at 3:15 p.m., leaning back in his ergonomic executive chair with his arms crossed behind his head like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. The fluorescent lights in Cortec's fourth-floor conference room reflected off his $800 designer glasses while he dismissed 8 years of work that had built 40% of the company's technology value, work that I'd performed under a contract that specifically retained my intellectual property ownership while granting Cortec an exclusive license, a distinction he apparently hadn't bothered to understand before making acquisition promises he couldn't keep. I'd been Cortec Analytics' lead software architect for 8 years, 1 month, and 17 days. Working 60-plus-hour weeks building every core algorithm that made the company's analytics platform valuable enough for an $87 million acquisition offer, and Brandon had decided that my contractor status meant I was disposable, replaceable, and certainly not worth the $115,000 salary increase that would bring my compensation in line with what full-time employees with equivalent expertise were earning at comparable companies. I'm Diana Foster, and I sat in that conference room knowing exactly what Section 4.2 of my December 2016 independent contractor agreement said. Contractor retains all intellectual property rights to work product created, granting company exclusive, perpetual, royalty-bearing license for use in company's business operations. And exactly what would happen when DataCorp's due diligence team asked to see proof of IP ownership for the algorithms they were paying $87 million to acquire. 8 years, 1 month, and 17 days of designing predictive analytics algorithms, building machine learning models, creating data processing architectures, and optimizing performance systems that handled 17 million data points per second. And Brandon had decided that paying me $185 per hour as a contractor was more cost-effective than converting me to a full-time employee with salary, benefits, and equity compensation that would have totaled $320,000 annually. I wasn't the chief technology officer who attended board meetings and made strategic technology decisions or the vice president of engineering who managed the development team and allocated resources across projects. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with 142,673 miles and laptop bags in the back seat because I worked from coffee shops between meetings at Cortec's office to save on expensive downtown parking fees. I lived in a 720-square-foot one-bedroom apartment in San Jose's east side with a home office that contained 3 monitors displaying code architecture diagrams, a whiteboard covered in algorithm flow charts, and file boxes holding 8 years of development documentation that proved exactly when I'd created each piece of technology and under what contractual terms. I was methodical about documentation, protective of my work quality, and careful about contract language, and apparently Brandon thought these characteristics made me difficult to work with, rather than the person who built the technology you're trying to sell for $87 million. I joined Cortec Analytics in December 2016 when they were a struggling 12-person startup burning through their series of funding without having built a working product. The company had raised $4.2 million from angels and early-stage VCs based on founder Kevin Chen's background in enterprise software and his vision for predictive analytics tools that could help mid-market companies make data-driven decisions without hiring expensive data science teams. The problem was that Kevin was a business development guy who understood customer pain points but didn't understand the technical architecture required to build analytics software that could actually deliver on the promises he was making to potential clients. Cortec had hired 2 junior developers who'd built a prototype that crashed when processing datasets larger than 50,000 rows and produced predictions that were wrong approximately 67% of the time, worse than random guessing for many of the business metrics customers cared about. Kevin found me through a mutual connection who knew I'd just finished a contract building fraud detection algorithms for a fintech startup. We met at a Palo Alto coffee shop on December 8, 2016. Kevin explained that Cortec needed someone who could rebuild their analytics engine from scratch, that they couldn't afford to hire a senior engineer full-time, and that they were willing to pay $185 per hour for contract work with flexible scheduling. We need someone who can build production-quality machine learning systems, Kevin had explained, showing me the current prototype's architecture on his laptop. But we're bootstrapping on limited runway. Can't do full-time salaries for senior people yet. I reviewed their code architecture for approximately 40 minutes, taking notes about the fundamental problems with their approach. Data processing was inefficient. The prediction models used inappropriate algorithms for the problem types. Error handling was non-existent. Scalability was impossible with their current structure. I can rebuild this, I'd said. But I need clear contract terms about intellectual property ownership. Kevin looked surprised. Don't most contractors sign standard IP assignment agreements? Most contractors do. I don't. I build algorithms and architectures that have significant commercial value. If I'm building this as a contractor rather than as a full-time employee with equity participation, I retain IP ownership and grant you an exclusive license for your business use. What's the practical difference? The practical difference is that I own what I create, but you have exclusive rights to use it for your business. You can't sell or license my work to other companies without my consent. But you can use it for Cortex operations, which is what you need. Kevin had consulted with Cortex lawyer, who'd advised that the arrangement was unusual but acceptable for a cash-strapped startup that couldn't afford senior talent at full-time market rates. On December 15, 2016, I signed an independent contractor agreement that contained very specific language in Section 4.2. Contractor retains all right, title, and interest in and to any intellectual property, inventions, algorithms, code, designs, or other work product created by contractor during performance of services under this agreement, contractor IP. Contractor hereby grants to company an exclusive, perpetual, worldwide, royalty-bearing license to use, reproduce, modify, and create derivative works from contractor IP solely for company's internal business operations and for incorporation into company's products and services. Company acknowledges that contractor retains ownership of contractor IP and that any transfer of such ownership rights requires separate written agreement and fair market value compensation. The royalty-bearing license was structured at 5% of any revenue Cortex generated from products incorporating my algorithms, payable quarterly. For the first 3 years, when Cortex was pre-revenue or generating minimal revenue, this royalty structure meant I was paid primarily through my hourly rate. The contract also specified that if Cortex wanted to transfer IP ownership to a third party, such as in an acquisition, they would need my written consent and would owe me fair market value compensation for the IP transfer. I'd negotiated these terms carefully because I'd learned from previous contracts where I'd built valuable technology that companies then sold or licensed without compensating me appropriately. Kevin had agreed to the terms because he was desperate for someone who could build working technology and because he didn't anticipate that Cortex would become valuable enough for the IP ownership distinction to matter financially. Over the next 7 years, I built essentially all of Cortex core technology. I designed the data processing architecture that could handle datasets with millions of rows in real time. I developed machine learning algorithms that actually predicted business outcomes with 73 to 89% accuracy across different use cases. I created the user interface frameworks that made complex analytics accessible to non-technical business users. I optimized the database queries and caching systems that made the software fast enough for practical use. By 2019, Cortex had 47 enterprise clients paying between $35,000 and $180,000 annually for analytics software that was essentially my work wrapped in Kevin's business development and the company's customer success operations. Revenue reached $4.8 million. Cortex raised a $12 million Series B at a $45 million valuation, with investors specifically citing the proprietary analytics technology and algorithms as key value drivers. I was still being paid $185 per hour, which translated to approximately $193,000 annually for the 40-plus hours per week I was actually working. Plus 5% royalties on revenue, which by 2019 meant an additional $240,000 annually. Total compensation, $433,000. That sounds substantial until you realize that senior software engineers at comparable companies were earning $280,000 to $350,000 in salary plus equity that was worth millions when companies got acquired or went public. I was earning decent contractor rates but missing the equity participation that would have made me wealthy as Cortex valuation increased. I raised this issue with Kevin in June 2019. Suggesting that Cortex convert me to a full-time employee with equity compensation that reflected my contribution to the company's technology value. Diana, we'd love to bring you on full-time eventually, Kevin had said during our meeting at Cortex office. But right now we need to preserve equity for key hires we're making in sales and business development. The board wants us focused on revenue growth. Your contract is working well, you're earning good money, you have flexibility, and we're paying you fairly for your contributions. I was earning $433,000 while Kevin was earning a $240,000 salary plus equity that was worth approximately $9 million after the Series B. The head of sales had $6.2 million in equity. The CFO had $4.7 million. The junior developers who implemented my designs had equity worth $800,000 to $1.2 million each. But I was the contractor who was being paid fairly. I raised the issue again in March 2021, after Cortec closed a $28 million Series C at a $180 million valuation. Revenue had reached $18.7 million annually. I was now earning $185 per hour plus 5% of revenue, approximately $193,000 in hourly fees plus $935,000 in royalties, totaling $1.128 million annually. Again, that sounds substantial until you realize that my algorithms were generating $18 million in annual revenue and that comparable companies were paying senior architects $350,000 to $500,000 in salary plus equity worth $10 to $30 million at successful companies. Kevin's response in March 2021, Diana, you're making over $1 million a year. That's more than I make in salary. I don't understand why you're unhappy with the arrangement. Because I don't have equity in the company I built the technology for, I'd explained. When Cortec gets acquired or goes public, everyone with equity will make millions. I'll make my hourly rate and royalties, which stop when the company changes ownership. The board sees your contractor relationship as working well. Changing it now would require repricing equity and restructuring your compensation. It's complicated. It's complicated because you waited until the company was worth $180 million to address it. If you'd converted me in 2019 when I first asked, it would have been simple. I'll bring it up with the board again, but I can't make promises. The board never approved equity compensation for the contractor who'd built 40% of their technology value. In February 2023, Kevin Chen stepped down as CEO. The board wanted to bring in an experienced operator who could scale Cortec toward an acquisition or IPO. They hired Brandon Sullivan, who'd been VP of operations at a mid-sized SaaS company that had been acquired by a private equity firm for $340 million. Brandon was 42 years old, had an MBA from a second-tier business school, wore expensive suits, used phrases like operational excellence and strategic initiatives, and had approximately zero understanding of how software was actually built or what made Cortec's technology valuable. Our first interaction was during Brandon's second week, when he called a meeting with key technical personnel to understand Cortec's product architecture. I explained the analytics engine, the machine learning models, the data processing pipeline, and the scalability optimizations I'd built over 7 years. Brandon had nodded along, taking notes on his iPad, and then asked, "So how much of this could we outsource to reduce costs?" "There are offshore development shops that could probably maintain this for a fraction of what we're spending on engineering. You could outsource the maintenance and minor feature additions," I'd said carefully. "But the core algorithms and architecture require someone who understands the mathematical principles and the business logic. That's specialized knowledge that takes years to build." "Everything's specialized until you document it properly," Brandon had replied. "That's just a knowledge management problem." I'd smiled politely and said nothing, understanding immediately that Brandon was exactly the type of executive who thought technology was a commodity that could be managed like office supplies or janitorial services. Over the next year, Brandon focused on operational efficiency, which mostly meant cutting costs and pushing for faster revenue growth. He hired expensive consultants to analyze Cortec's business model. He implemented new project management processes that required engineers to attend more meetings and file more status reports. He pushed the sales team to close larger deals with aggressive pricing. The company's revenue growth accelerated, from $18.7 million in 2021 to $27.3 million in 2022 to $38.9 million in 2023. Brandon took credit for this growth during board meetings, despite the fact that the revenue was coming from products built on algorithms I'd spent 8 years developing. My compensation continued at $185 per hour plus 5% royalties. In 2023, that meant approximately $193,000 in hourly fees plus $1.945 million in royalties, totaling $2.138 million. Brandon's compensation package included $425,000 base salary, $300,000 performance bonus, and equity worth approximately $18 million at Cortech's projected valuation for a Series D round or acquisition. On March 14, 2024, Brandon called a budget review meeting to discuss compensation for key personnel ahead of a potential acquisition process. Present were Brandon, CFO Patricia Morrison, and me. Brandon opened by explaining that Cortech was in preliminary discussions with several potential acquirers and that we needed to rationalize our cost structure to make the company more attractive to buyers. "Diana, I wanted to discuss your contractor arrangement," Brandon had said, pulling up a spreadsheet on the conference room monitor. "You're currently our highest paid individual contributor. Last year you earned $2.1 million in total compensation, hourly fees plus royalties. That's significantly higher than what we pay full-time senior engineers." "That's because I built the technology that generates the revenue you're paying royalties on," I'd replied. "The royalty structure was negotiated in my original contract to compensate for not receiving equity." "I understand that. But as we prepare for an acquisition, potential buyers are going to look at our cost structure. Having a contractor earning $2 million annually is going to raise questions about whether we're managing compensation efficiently." "What are you proposing?" "We'd like to convert you to a full-time employee. Salary of $280,000, standard benefits package, and we'll eliminate the royalty structure. In exchange, we'll grant you stock options worth approximately $400,000 at current valuation, vesting over 4 years." I'd calculated the numbers instantly in my head. $280,000 salary versus $2.1 million total compensation. Stock options that might be worth $400,000 if Cortech got acquired at their projected valuation, vesting over 4 years, versus royalties I was earning immediately. A pay cut of approximately $1.8 million annually in exchange for uncertain future equity. "That's an 87% pay cut," I'd said. "Why would I accept that?" "Because full-time employees at your level earn $280,000 to $320,000. Your current compensation is anomalous. We're offering to normalize it and give you equity participation going forward. My current compensation reflects the value I've created. I built 40% of Cortech's technology value. The royalty structure was specifically negotiated to compensate for not receiving equity when the company was worth $45 million. Now you want to eliminate the royalties when the company's worth $300 million and give me options worth less than 1 year of my current royalty payments." Brandon had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed behind his head, with that particular expression executives get when they're about to explain why their unreasonable position is actually perfectly reasonable. "Diana, I appreciate your contributions to Cortech. But we need to be realistic about market compensation and about what's appropriate for a contractor versus a full-time employee. We don't negotiate with part-time contractors. If you want to be treated like a full-time employee with full-time compensation, you need to be a full-time employee. Otherwise, we'll need to find someone who's willing to work within our compensation structure." I'd sat there for approximately 15 seconds, feeling that particular combination of anger and amusement that comes from knowing someone has just made a catastrophic mistake while being completely confident they're right. "I'm not a part-time contractor," I'd said quietly. "I work 60 hours a week. I've built essentially all of your core technology. And my contract specifies that I own the intellectual property I've created, with Cortech holding an exclusive license. If you want to find someone else, you'll need to rebuild the technology from scratch, because my contract doesn't transfer IP ownership when I leave." Brandon had glanced at Patricia, who was looking suddenly uncomfortable. "Our legal team will review that," Brandon had said. "But I'm confident that the work you performed for Cortech, using Cortech resources, during your contract period belongs to Cortech. That's standard employment law." "It's standard employment law for employees," I replied. "Not for independent contractors with explicit IP retention clauses. But you're welcome to have your lawyers review Section 4.2 of my December 2016 contractor agreement." The meeting had ended with Brandon saying he'd discuss the matter with the legal team and get back to me with a final offer. I'd left the conference room knowing exactly what was going to happen next, and knowing that Brandon had just created an $87 million problem he didn't understand yet. Now about 47% of you think I'm about to sabotage Cortex acquisition by refusing to cooperate or by somehow destroying the technology one built, and you're completely wrong. Subscribe right now, because what actually happens is that DataCorp's due diligence team does exactly what due diligence teams are supposed to do. They verify ownership of the assets they're paying $87 million to acquire, and they discover that Cortex doesn't actually own 40% of their technology value. They just license it from a contractor who the CEO just tried to lowball on compensation. The lesson here isn't about revenge or sabotage. It's about reading contracts carefully before making promises you can't keep, and about understanding that contractor and employee aren't just different tax classifications, they're different legal relationships with different ownership implications for intellectual property. On April 18, 2024, Brandon called an all-hands meeting to announce that Cortex Analytics had received an acquisition offer from DataCorp, a publicly traded enterprise software company. The offer was $87 million in cash, representing a significant return for investors and a successful exit for everyone with equity. Brandon stood at the front of Cortex main office, projecting enthusiasm and pride, explaining how this acquisition validated Cortex technology and business model. He thanked the team for their hard work. He talked about how Cortex employees would have opportunities to work on larger problems at a larger company. He mentioned that the transaction was expected to close within 60 to 90 days, pending due diligence and regulatory approval. I'd sat in the back of the room, listening to Brandon take credit for building a company valuable enough to acquire, and thinking about Section 4.2 of my contract. After the all-hands meeting, I'd sent an email to Brandon and Patricia, subject, IP ownership documentation for due diligence. Brandon and Patricia, congratulations on the acquisition offer. As you prepare due diligence materials for DataCorp, please note that certain technology components were developed under my independent contractor agreement, which retained IP ownership while granting Cortex an exclusive license. Section 4.2 of my December 2016 agreement specifies that transfer of IP ownership to third parties requires my written consent and fair market value compensation. I'm happy to discuss terms for IP transfer as part of the acquisition process. Please have your legal team contact me to begin negotiations. Diana. I'd CC'd Cortex General Counsel, Michael Park, to ensure the message was clearly documented in company records. Brandon's response came 4 hours later. Diana, our legal team has reviewed your contract and believes that work performed for Cortex using company resources during your contractor engagement constitutes work for hire that belongs to Cortex. We'll address any questions during due diligence, but we don't anticipate issues with IP ownership. Brandon. I'd replied immediately. Brandon, Section 4.2 explicitly states that I retain IP ownership. Work for hire provisions don't override explicit contract language. I recommend your legal team review the contract again before providing IP ownership representations to DataCorp. Diana. No response. DataCorp's due diligence team began their work in early May 2024. This included financial review, legal review, technical review, and customer contract review. The technical review team, led by DataCorp's VP of Engineering, requested detailed documentation about Cortex technology architecture, including ownership verification for all intellectual property. On May 9, 2024, I received an email from Jennifer Caldwell, DataCorp's Associate General Counsel. Diana, as part of our due diligence review for the Cortex acquisition, we're verifying ownership of technology assets. Our review indicates you developed significant portions of Cortex Analytics platform under an independent contractor agreement. Could you please provide documentation regarding IP ownership terms and licensing arrangements? Jennifer Caldwell, Associate General Counsel, DataCorp. I'd responded with a copy of my December 2016 contractor agreement, highlighting Section 4.2, along with a summary. Jennifer, attached is my contractor agreement with Cortex. Section 4.2 specifies that I retain ownership of IP I developed, while granting Cortex an exclusive license for their business operations. My work includes core predictive analytics algorithms, estimated 40% of platform value, machine learning model architectures, data processing pipeline systems, real-time optimization frameworks. I've informed CoreTech that IP transfer to a third party requires separate negotiation and fair market compensation per contract terms. I'm happy to discuss licensing or transfer arrangements as part of the acquisition. Diana Foster. 3 hours later, I received a phone call from Michael Park, CoreTech's general counsel. Diana, we need to talk about your email to DataCorp's legal team. I responded honestly to their due diligence question about IP ownership. You're creating problems for the acquisition. Brandon is extremely upset. DataCorp is concerned that we've misrepresented our IP ownership. Have you misrepresented your IP ownership? Silence. Michael, your acquisition agreement probably includes representations that CoreTech owns all the IP in the technology DataCorp is buying. But you don't own my IP, you license it. That's a material misrepresentation unless you disclose the licensing arrangement. We disclosed that some technology was developed by contractors. Did you disclose that the contractor retained IP ownership and that transfer requires separate compensation? Longer silence. We need to resolve this quickly, Michael finally said. DataCorp wants this acquisition to close by July 1st. If we can't provide clear IP ownership, they might walk away or reduce their offer significantly. Then Brandon should have thought about that before dismissing me as a part-time contractor, who doesn't deserve fair compensation. This isn't about your compensation dispute. This is about whether CoreTech can complete this acquisition. It's about both, I'd said. You're asking me to transfer IP ownership that I specifically negotiated to retain. That has significant financial value. The contract requires fair market compensation. Let's start there. On May 13, 2024, I met with Brandon, Patricia, Michael, and 2 outside attorneys CoreTech had hired to handle the acquisition. The meeting took place in a conference room at the attorney's office in downtown San Francisco. Brandon started by attempting reconciliation. Diana, I think we got off on the wrong foot in March. You're an incredibly valuable part of CoreTech, and we want to make sure you're treated fairly as part of this acquisition. I'd said nothing, waiting for him to make an offer. We'd like to propose a resolution that works for everyone. We'll convert you to a full-time employee immediately, with a salary of $320,000, higher than our March offer. We'll grant you stock options equivalent to 0.5% of the acquisition price, which would be worth $435,000. And we'll include a retention bonus of $200,000, payable over 2 years post-acquisition. Total immediate value of approximately $635,000, plus $320,000 annual salary going forward. I'd run the math. $635,000 upfront, plus salary that was still $1.8 million less annually than my current compensation, in exchange for IP that represented 40% of an $87 million acquisition, approximately $34.8 million in value to DataCorp. No, I'd said. What would it take? Patricia asked. A fair market valuation of the IP I'm transferring. 40% of CoreTech's technology value equals approximately 40% of the acquisition value attributable to technology. Let's estimate that 80% of the $87 million acquisition price is technology value, $69.6 million. 40% of that is $27.84 million. That's the value you're asking me to transfer ownership of. Brandon looked like I'd suggested burning the building down. We can't pay you $28 million. That's a third of the acquisition price. Then we need to structure this differently. I'll transfer IP ownership for a percentage of the acquisition price, plus conversion to full-time employment with equity that reflects my contribution. One of the outside attorneys spoke up. What percentage are you proposing? 2% of the acquisition price, $1.74 million, plus conversion to full-time employment at $280,000 salary with equity grant of 1% of post-acquisition company value, vesting over 4 years. The lawyers and executives whispered among themselves. Then Brandon spoke. Diana, be reasonable. We're a startup that took significant risk to build this company. You were compensated well as a contractor. You made over $2 million last year. We can't give you another $2 million just to clean up IP paperwork. This isn't paperwork. This is ownership transfer of technology that I built and that you're selling for $87 million. My contract explicitly retained ownership rights. If you'd converted me to a full-time employee with equity in 2019 when I first requested it, I'd own approximately 3% of the company and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Instead, you kept me as a contractor with IP retention rights, and now those rights have significant financial value. Patricia asked, "What's your minimum acceptable offer?" $1.4 million cash for IP transfer, plus conversion to full-time employee at $280,000 salary. No equity. I recognize that the acquisition is happening and equity won't matter post-transaction. But I need fair compensation for the IP transfer. More whispered conversations. We'll discuss with the board and DataCorp and get back to you within 72 hours, Michael said. On May 16, 2024, I received a formal offer from CorTech, IP transfer and employment agreement. Diana Foster agrees to transfer all ownership rights to intellectual property developed during contractor engagement with CorTech Analytics, including algorithms, code, architectures, and systems specified in Appendix A. In consideration for IP transfer, CorTech agrees to 1. Pay $1,400,000 to Diana Foster within 10 business days of agreement execution. 2. Convert Diana Foster to full-time employee status effective May 20, 2024. 3. Annual salary of $280,000. 4. Standard benefits package. 5. Retention bonus of $150,000 payable 6 months post-acquisition if Diana remains employed. Diana Foster agrees to 1. Transfer all IP ownership rights specified in Appendix A. 2. Continue employment through acquisition close and minimum 6-month post-acquisition transition period. 3. Cooperate with due diligence process and provide technical documentation as requested. I'd reviewed the agreement with my own attorney, negotiated a few minor changes to the retention bonus terms, and signed on May 17, 2024. CorTech wired $1,400,000 to my account on May 24, 2024. I'd converted from contractor to employee, with a salary that was $1.858 million less than my previous total compensation, but with $1.4 million upfront to compensate for the IP transfer and the loss of future royalties. The acquisition closed on June 28, 2024. DataCorp paid $87 million to acquire CorTech Analytics. I'd stayed on as lead software architect at the combined company, working on integrating CorTech's technology into DataCorp's enterprise platform. Brandon Sullivan was terminated as CEO 3 weeks after the acquisition closed. The board, now including DataCorp executives, determined that Brandon had created significant risk to the transaction by failing to understand IP ownership issues and by attempting to resolve the problem by dismissing the contractor who owned critical technology as a part-time contributor who didn't deserve fair compensation. In September 2024, I ran into Brandon at a coffee shop in Palo Alto. He was working as a consultant for a venture capital firm, helping them evaluate potential investments in enterprise software companies. He approached cautiously. "Diana, I heard about how things worked out. That was quite an outcome for you." I looked at him directly. "It was the outcome specified in my contract, Brandon. Section 4.2, December 2016. IP ownership retained by contractor. Transfer requires written consent and fair market compensation. You had 8 years to read that contract carefully before making acquisition promises that required my cooperation." Brandon tried to defend himself. "Our lawyers told us we had strong arguments for work-for-hire ownership." I responded, "Your lawyers gave you optimistic legal opinions because that's what you wanted to hear. But contract language is clear. And due diligence teams verify ownership before closing $87 million acquisitions. If you'd negotiated with me honestly in March, offered fair compensation instead of calling me a part-time contractor, we could have resolved this for much less than $1.4 million. Instead, you created an acquisition-threatening problem that cost you your job." Brandon walked away without responding. Here's the thing about contractors versus employees. The classification isn't just about taxes and benefits. It's about legal relationships, particularly regarding intellectual property ownership. Employees generally don't own the work they create, it belongs to the employer under work-for-hire doctrine. Contractors can negotiate to retain IP ownership, granting clients licenses instead of ownership transfers. Most contractors sign standard IP assignment agreements because they don't understand the value of what they're creating or because they need the work and can't negotiate better terms. I'd learned from previous contracts where I'd built valuable technology and watched companies profit from my work without compensating me appropriately. When CoreTech was desperate for someone who could build working software, and when they couldn't afford to hire senior talent at market rates, they agreed to contract terms that retained my IP ownership. They thought they were saving money on salary and equity. What they actually did was create a deferred compensation obligation that would come due when they tried to sell the company. Brandon thought contractor meant disposable and part-time and not worth negotiating with. What it actually meant was, owns the intellectual property you're trying to sell for $87 million and has explicit contract language giving them leverage in acquisition negotiations. The math is simple, really. CoreTech paid me approximately $5.6 million over 8 years in hourly fees and royalties. They paid me $1.4 million for IP transfer when they got acquired. Total compensation, $7 million for building 40% of the technology that sold for $87 million. That's approximately 8% of the value I created, less than what I would have received if they'd given me 3% equity in 2019 when I first asked. But Brandon thought I should accept a $1.8 million annual pay cut and feel grateful for $400,000 in stock options because I was just a part-time contractor. You want to classify someone as a contractor to avoid paying benefits and equity? Go ahead. But read the contract, understand what IP ownership means, and recognize that independent contractor means they're independent. They can negotiate terms that protect their interests, including retaining ownership of valuable work they create. Brandon learned this lesson approximately 3 months too late to save his job. DataCorp's board learned it during due diligence when they discovered they were buying technology that CoreTech didn't actually own. CoreTech's investors learned it when the acquisition almost fell apart over IP ownership issues. I learned it after my first contract when I built valuable technology, assigned all rights to the client, and watched them sell it for millions without compensating me fairly. The difference is, I actually learned from experience and negotiated better terms next time. Some people just keep making the same mistake, underestimating contractors until the contracts matter. The contract doesn't disappear because someone calls you part-time. The IP ownership doesn't vanish because an executive decides you're not worth negotiating with. And due diligence teams don't skip the ownership verification step because a CEO promises them everything is fine. Brandon thought my contractor status made me powerless. What it actually made me was the owner of 40% of his $87 million exit strategy.